Okay, so we are looking at the cloud of unknowing. It's a Christian scripture, or not scripture, but a Christian writing, I believe from the 1500s, describing what a Vedantin would call the practice of meditation, bhakti meditation, where you repeat a mantra, which is something that leads the mind toward God, either the name of God. Well, in Vedanta, it would be the name of God, a name of God, with some bead mantras, which means some words that whose meaning is so old they don't even know what it meant. But the mantra has been maintained through the years, and even though those words no are not in use anymore, they've kept them. And they usually surround a name of God, which is your chosen ideal. So if you were a Buddhist, you'd be given a mantra, something like Om Hrim Buddhaya Namaha, or if you were a Christian and you wanted to practice meditation, they'd give you Om Hrim Ishaya, Jesus' name in Sanskrit, Ishaya Namaha, as an example, right? And so that name of God is meant to expand within you at each time you repeat it. The name and form can't be separated. So it's thought that the mantra is God, that you can't say God's name without God being invoked. And so the Christians apparently also had this practice in the 1500s, and this book has been teaching us how to do it. But in doing so, they've introduced quite a bit of the Christian theology around it and cautioned us. Well, I think we lost most of our viewers when they were cautioning us about misunderstanding the practice, and they got very much into the demons and the angels and the uh, sin and all of the upper hierarchy of Christian theology. And I think from the Vedantins that were watching, that was too much. So we are on chapter, I'm going to say 66, LXVI, whatever that, I think that's 66. Because L is 50, X is 10, V is 5, and I is 1. So yeah, 56. All right, and every chapter, as you know, has one of these little uh, summaries under it. I bothered to find the name out once, and I can't remember it in my old age. It says
Epigraph.
what is it?
Epigraph? I
Epigraph.
think, if I
Yes, that is
remember
it.
right. Yes,
That
epigraph. Yeah.
is. Look at you showing me up like that. This epigraph, the other secondary power, which is called sensuality, its activity and its obedience to the will before and after original sin. So this is what we're going to talk about here. And just as a note, as we've said quite a few times, that Christians measure man's nature after the fall of Adam. So we are by nature impure, according to standard Christian theology. But a Vedantin would maintain that Adam was not created in a fallen state. Adam was created in the image of God and then made a mistake and became fallen. And so his nature can't be defined by an action that changed him. The nature had to be defined as he was created, which is holy and uh, uh, and divine, because it is God's breath of life that gave him life, directly breathed into him. And so, how can that is animated by the breath of God be in a fallen state by nature? And
Yeah,
so, what's
I'm
that?
curious. Does Judaism also take the Old Testament? Is that their interpretation too, that we are fallen? Do you know?
Maureen, do you know in Judaism?
I don't know.
Okay.
Mhm. Oh, that'd be interesting, whether it's
Yeah,
particular.
yeah. I have never ever because Judaism pays very little attention to the idea of an afterlife. So
Mm,
I don't think that they would really be too concerned about that definition,
mm,
but potentially it is an Old Testament scripture. It is written by Moses, but
mm.
it's not a matter of the scripture. It's a matter of your interpretation of the scripture.
Yes, yes. Because I was curious because I know this within the range of Abrahamic religions. I know that Islam, taking that same story, the which like they do believe in Adam and they
Hmm.
don't think of man's inherent nature as sinful.
Ah,
Uh, and actually, one of their interpretation is that after God created, well, Allah for them created man, He asked the angels to bow down to human because mankind had free will that they could choose, and so in that sense. So yeah, it's very I exactly to the point that you were saying that it's a definite it's a matter of interpretation, like how that story is taken to be a matter of like original sin or we are sinful inherently. But so yeah, so that's why I was curious. It was like how it
yeah.
goes.
And if it was in man's nature to sin, right, then it would not have required a beguiler like the snake, like the serpent. If it was man's nature, it would not have required a beguiler to trick him into it or to talk
Ah,
him into it, right? But anyway, that is unofficial Vedantan Christian theology.
mm,
So from their
mm,
perspective, but this is why they have these kinds of issues where they have to talk about the nature of man and they have to talk about it, before and after original sin, right? And so, whereas if we just start at the beginning, we could just say without original sin, there's no such thing. And I know many modern Christian groups, like the church I grew up in, the Church of Christ, also did not have a concept of original sin. And you can usually tell because those branches of Christianity that uphold the idea of original sin will have infant baptism because they will say that if a baby dies, it goes to hell if it hasn't been baptized. But in some of the more modern day evangelical groups, they say that a child is not responsible for sin until they reach what's called the age of accountability, which means they understand right from wrong and choose to do wrong. And at that point, they get baptized. They make the choice. The child has to make the choice to be baptized.
That's the Mormon religion.
Is that Mormons also?
Yes, at age 8, they have to
Uh-huh.
understand what baptism is.
Right.
And then they also don't discipline until then, very little disciplining until then, because they don't understand what sinning is in,
Oh,
in their religion. Yes.
I like that. That's cool. That's cool. Of course, I would always tell people I'm 7.
I think my kids knew pretty early.
Yeah. Well, and so of course I was raised in that tradition, the Church of Christ, which is not the Latter-day Saints Church of Christ.
Yeah.
It's a fundamentalist group. They didn't like me at all. All right, so he goes on here. The sensuality is a power of the soul whose sphere of activity is in the bodily senses. Through it, we have knowledge and experience of all bodily creatures, whether they please us or not. It has two functions. One, through which it looks to our physical needs, right? So it tells you when you're hungry or when you've hurt your arm or when you've got a cut, right? Your bodily senses take care of you, try and take care of you. The other, through which it ministers to the pleasures of our senses, right? It is this power which complains when the body lacks what is necessary for it, and when we are seeking what the body needs, impels us to take more than is necessary in order to satisfy and minister to our pleasure. Right? Very interesting thing there. So it administers to the needs of the body, but when you actually give it the needs of the body, it wants excess, right, to store up for the body, and that becomes the pleasure. That becomes the part that is not helpful to us. It complains when we are deprived of creatures which please us, and greatly delights in the presence of such creatures when they are there. The presence of creatures which displease it annoys the sensuality, and it is greatly delighted by the absence of such creatures. This power itself and the object of its working are contained in the mind. Right. So it's the mind that holds our preferences and aversions, the things that we like and the things that we don't like. Before man sinned, the sensuality was so obedient to the will, it was its servant, in a manner of speaking, that it never presented the will with any inordinate pleasure or in repugnance for bodily creatures, or with any spiritual counterfeit of pleasure or pain induced by spiritual enemies of the bodily senses. But now, meaning after the sin, after the fall, it is not so, right? So basically, what he just said is before it, our body, the senses were controlled by the divine will, by our will that had no egoism in it, no sense of me and mine. And so initially, the senses were no problem at all because they were in strict obedience to our highest nature, our divine nature. After the fall, is when we had an idea of separation from God. We had an idea of egoism, which came from eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? The knowledge of good and evil is egoism. When we're separate from God, we can think counter to God. That's evil. Or we can be in alignment with God, in harmony with God, and that's vice and virtue, right? And so egoism is what allowed us to see that, or what gave us the knowledge of good and evil. So that's what that tree was. And when she ate the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, she became an ego individual, an ego self. And so before the ego was formed, we were what we will, when we, in Vedanta, when we become realized, we return to that native state where our mind, body, and senses are all in perfect harmony with divine will. And at that level, as we'll see by the end of the second chapter we're looking at here, it's because of our union with our highest self, our true self. Right? Okay. So after the fall, it is not so. For unless it is ruled by grace in the will, so that it can accept meekly and measurably the pain of original sin, which it experiences in the absence of pleasant things needed by the body, and in the presence of unpleasant things beneficial to the spirit, and also can refrain from lusting after those pleasant and necessary things, and from rejoicing excessively in the absence of those unpleasant but beneficial things, it will, in its wretchedness and wantonness, wallow like a swine in the mud, in the pleasures of this world and the foul flesh, so much that all our living becomes beastly and carnal instead of being human and spiritual. All right. So the beforehand is when we're in line with the divine will. The second hand is when we've created an ego will that's opposed to God. And that ego will is caused because egoism is identity of the spirit with body mind. We believe ourselves to be not spiritual. We believe ourselves to be physical, material, body and mind, right? And when we believe ourselves to be body, mind, and not spirit, that means that the spirit part, God, is not part of us, that the real us is body mind, and so body mind take charge of the senses. And that's what what he's saying happens here. Once it takes charge of the senses, you walk around wanting a drink, wanting sex, wanting pleasure, wanting power, and you find it, you see that the world finds it in very unpleasant ways, through declaring war, through fighting, through, uh, uh, you know, just a genuine overindulgence of the sense pleasures. And so he's just pointing that out to us. This next chapter, 37 or 67, he says, unless we know the powers of the soul and their way of working, we may easily be deceived in our understanding of spiritual words and spiritual activity, and our soul is made godlike by grace, right? Which is a beautiful thing. We saw that a little bit right up here in this previous chapter where he says that, let's see where is that. There it is. But now, meaning in our fallen nature, it is not so unless our nature is ruled by grace in its desires, in its will, right? So grace can return us to our original state. But since it returns us from the lower to the higher, we're still responsible for the lower. And that becomes important here by the end of the chapter, you'll see. He says, "You see then, my friend, into what a wretched state we are fallen because of original sin." Right? Once you've sinned, once you have an idea of yourself as body mind, as we all know from our spiritual practice, it's incredibly difficult to detach from those places because body mind gives us access to the created world, the world of a constant flow of unrepeating change. And that can be quite an interesting place to hang out, right? We don't want to go back to the one without a second in perfect contentment. That, from the mind's perspective, seems very boring, right? But in truth, it is the fulfillment of ourselves outside of time. So it's not a long time or a short time, it's outside of time. And so boredom really doesn't have a place there. We're outside of it. He says, "It is hardly surprising that we should be like blind men and be easily deceived in our understandings of spiritual words, and spiritual activities, particularly those of us who are ignorant of the powers of the soul and the way in which these powers operate." Right? So basically what he's saying is if you don't know that your nature is divine, and you don't know that um, that your nature is divine, then and you've attached to the senses, then this very uneven and what shall we say, uh, unnatural state of being will produce a lot of weird desires, right? And make us chase things that are not native to us, things that are not part of our nature. And if we don't act according to our nature, that's when we suffer. When we don't know that our nature is love, wisdom, and being, then we're not sure how to fulfill our life. And we try all different kinds of things. We try being a fireman. Oh, that's going to make me happy. Nope, didn't work. I'm going to be a ballet dancer next. Oh, no, that didn't fulfill me either. I'm going to be a teacher, right? Well, it filled me a little bit, but not much, not enough. And so that's because we don't know what we are. So we're wandering and looking not just for what makes us happy, but really looking for who we are. Who am I? What is this? But if you know your nature to be divine, that you are pure love, pure wisdom through being, then you know it doesn't matter what you're doing. What matters is how you do it, right? If you're a busboy, you can have a fulfilling life if you're loving through that. You know, you do your very best at bussing tables, and you make each table an offering to the divine as you clean it very nicely and arrange it also perfectly. Right. And then life as a busboy can become fulfilling, not because of the busboy nature, but because you are expressing your divine nature freely through being a busboy. Right. So if you're a busboy and think, oh, if I could only be, the restaurant manager, then I'd be happy. That's going through the body mind and trying to search for happiness, not based on your nature, but based on your body mind. That's not going to last because nothing of the body lasts. Right? And so in this life, it's not what you do that's going to make you happy or unhappy. It's how you do it. If you do it in harmony with your nature of love and wisdom, you're going to have a fulfilling life as a byproduct. If you don't know who you are and you just follow the senses to try and define yourself, you're going to have a life of up and downs, sometimes extreme, sometimes not so extreme, but just a lot of up and downs. So it's hardly surprising that we should be like blind men and women who don't know our divine nature and be easily deceived, right? We can easily be taken advantage of if we don't know what we are. It doesn't seem so bad to be lusty. It doesn't seem so bad to be selfish in little things, of course, you know. So it's no doubt that we should be like blind men and be easily deceived in our understandings of spiritual words and spiritual activities. Because what would we know of spiritual if we don't know who we are, right? If we don't know what we are. So whenever your mind is occupied with any material thing, right? When your mind is thinking of objects, that's how Vedantin would say that. Anytime your mind is engrossed in objects, no matter how good the end in view may be, you are still beneath yourself in this working and outside of yourself, right? Because your nature is not material. And so as long as the mind is filled with material things, you're outside of yourself. You have left the building, as it were. Okay. And you're beneath yourself, meaning that God, our divine nature, is what created material things. And so you are below in your nature because you are identifying as a created being at that point. You're not identified with the divine. And whenever you are aware that your mind is occupied with the intricacies of the powers of your soul and the way in which they operate in spiritual matters, such things as your own vices or virtues or any other spiritual creature who is on par with you by nature, to the end that by this activity you may learn to know yourself and advance in perfection, then you are within yourself, right? You're being true to your nature and on par with yourself. You're in integrity. You are in a state of integrity because you are an expression of your true self, right? But whenever you are aware that your mind is occupied with no created thing, right? So your mind would be in a state of awareness, but not consciousness. Consciousness is awareness with objects in it. So what he's saying here is that if you are aware that your mind is occupied with no created thing, right? Nothing that is material, whether material or spiritual, meaning it doesn't matter if you're thinking of Jesus, Buddha, or a rock, but that your mind is only with the substance of God himself, right? So this would be pure mind to the Vedanta, to the Buddhist. Pure mind is a mind that has absolutely no sense of me and mine in it, because the scriptures teach that me and mine is what caused the universe, right? And in Christianity, it's the same. It's Adam and Eve's adoption of egoism, their senses as their being, that caused them to be thrown out of the garden, right? That caused them in this life. So both traditions have the same principle for the beginning of the universe, or the beginning of mankind. So let's read this whole sentence here again because it's a complex one. But whenever you are aware that your mind is occupied with no created thing, right? No object, whether material or spiritual, right? So it's pure mind, empty mind, still mind, a mind with no thought in it, but only with the substance of God himself, right? Which is actually mind, pure mind, and Brahman, right? Which is God without form. Pure mind, a mind with no ripples in it, no thoughts, because it has no sense of me and mine. It has no sense of particular. It's universal in that state. That then that it is obvious that it is God. It is that material which can become all things, right? All things grow from pure mind. All things are thought, right? Everything that you're seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, or smelling at this very moment exists for you only in the mind, right? Because you cannot have an experience of an imagined external world directly, because everything you touch gets interpreted by the senses and then given to you through the mind to experience it. But you can't touch anything in this world directly. It has to be touched by the senses, which interprets it, gives you the nerve information, and from the nerve information, the mind creates a symbol for the world that you live in. So what he's saying here is if you have no symbols in your mind, no thoughts in the mind, then you are experiencing only the substance of God himself. And as indeed the mind is and can be in the experience of the exercise described in this book, then you are above yourself and under God. Right? So once you've attained this still mind state, you are uh, spiritual in nature, right? You know that your nature is spirit, but at the same time, you're aware of yourself, and so you're bodily inclined. So in that sense, you're below yourself, right? You haven't become pure spirit. You're pure spirit still embodied in the material. So while you are true to yourself, you are still not fully yourself because you are separated from the whole. The substance of God in himself, as indeed the mind is, and can be in the experience of the exercise described in this book, then you are above yourself, meaning you are like God, and you are under God, meaning you still have an awareness of yourself as separate in a body. You are above yourself because you are striving by grace to reach a point to which you cannot come by nature, right? So he's saying that you're striving to return to your divine nature, right? Your perfect harmony with the beloved, with the divine. You're striving for that through grace because there's no other way to attain it. Why? Because you were created perfect and you were expected to be perfect. And when you deviated from that perfection by buying into an identity in the senses and body, uh, there was no way for you to get back. Within the Christian and Jewish paradigms, actually all of the Abrahamic religions, there's this notion that sin must be paid for, right? And you can't pay for it yourself because the expectation was perfection. And when you fell below that perfection, you can never return to it again. It's like the first time, if you've got taking a class and you've got 100% average in your grades, and then one test you didn't study for and you got a C on it, no matter how long you get 100%, your average is never going to be actually 100% again. It's always going to be a fraction below it. And so that's what he's saying here, right? That there is no way except through grace for you to return to this perfect state. You are above yourself because you are striving by grace to reach a point to which you cannot come by nature, right? You can't get there mathematically, in other words. You can't get to a pure 100 if you've ever had less than 100 in your average. That is to say, to be made one with God in spirit and in love and in oneness of wills. You are beneath your God, for though it can be said that during this time God and yourself are not two, but one in spirit, then insofar as you or any other who experiences the perfection of this work, because of this oneness and by witness of the Holy Scriptures, may be truly called a God, nevertheless you are still beneath him because of your knowledge of body, because of your identity with body. Even in this perfect state, he's saying. Right? And so this is why grace exists, and this is why God can only be seen through grace, right? To bring it up to that point. And that grace of God, I don't know, can be appealed for in many ways. You know, in the Old Testament, it was through sacrifice and ritual. In the New Testament, it was through faith in a sacrifice by God. Same idea. Something has to pay. Something has to cover that distance between you and perfection. Right. He says, for he is God by nature from without beginning. Right. So this is what he's saying. God has always been divine by nature and always from the very beginning that way. So he has a he's perfect. Be you therefore perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. He's been running 100% on his tests for eternity. So he's got the hold on perfection. For he is God by nature from without beginning. And there was a time when you were nothing in substance, right? There was a time when Vedanta also teaches that. There was a time when we had no existence. We didn't come out of nothing because we are not material, right? We are basically composed of ignorance. This individual incarnated self only exists to the ego, in the ego state. When we come to realize God, it's absolute oneness in the Vedanta. We realize the body was a dream body that was within us, that we were never in the body. We were never actually the body. We only thought ourselves to be the body. And through that attachment to the body, we experienced the body. And through experience the body, to any sense that we had an idea that we were the doer, we were actuating ourselves. To that degree, we created a prison that held us in the body so that we couldn't get back to our divine state until that karmic balance was restored. So you see, it's kind of the same story on both sides of the fence, just described in quite a different way there. So there was a time when you were nothing in substance, and even afterward, when you were by his power and love made something, then deliberately by sin you made yourself worse than nothing. Right? So God, by his grace, gives you life, and then you turn around and counter the will of God. You've now become less than nothing. You were a better state when you were in a better state in your uncreated non-existence than you are in a fallen state, according to this theology. It is only by his mercy and without any merit of yours that you are made a God in grace, united with him in spirit without any division between you, both here and in the happiness of heaven without end. So he says, though you are one with him in grace, you are yet far, far beneath him in nature. Okay, so this is where the Christians and the Vedantists would have something to discuss, right? Because the reason being, it's necessary in Christianity for you to be less than God because you're required to maintain a sense of separateness in order to enjoy heaven, right? If you merged completely into God and then were sent to heaven, you wouldn't care at all. You wouldn't enjoy it at all because there's no you, there's no ego self to experience heaven. And so to solve that problem, Christians have said that you basically always have a body and will always be separate from God, that even on that account, or always less than God, because you'll be able to experience heaven. But in truth, you are one in spirit, right? That and Vedanta believes that man is only spirit, right? Who through ignorance identifies with an imagined material and an imagined world, right? But the Christians are saying that no, you will always be separate from God in the sense that you will always be less than God because you have just enough me in mind to create a body, create a sense of separate. So you will always be less than God, even though in spirit you're one with God. So you can see, my friend, from what I say, at least in part, that he who is ignorant of the powers of his own soul and the way in which these powers operate can very easily be deceived in his understanding of words which are set down with a spiritual meaning. Right? That's just kind of a long way of saying that if you don't know who you are and you go about trying to make yourself happy, you are at a great disadvantage. Because how can you make yourself happy when you are not aware of what your fundamental nature is as love, wisdom, and being, right? And so you'll try lots of things that aren't wise, and you'll try lots of things that aren't loving in order to find happiness, and it will lead you in a great run of error, a great run of pain. You can also see in some way the reason why I did not dare to bid you openly to show your desire to God, but I bade you to do all that you could to hide it and to conceal it like a child. And I still do so for fear that you should understand bodily what is meant spiritually. Right. And so this notion, don't show your desire to God. All right. Well, to conceal it like a child, because to show your desire to God is to be separate from and an expression of separate from. And so he says, I still tell you to hide it or conceal it like a child, which means be guileless, be innocent like a child, by not being identified with or even acknowledging that you were body, that you have a body. Right? Conceal it like a child, and I still do so for fear that you should understand bodily what is meant spiritually. Right? He wants you to not consider that because he doesn't want you to accidentally think that a spiritual truth means something in a bodily way, right? So that you don't use grace as a license to chase body and mind desires, but that you always remain true to spirit and live almost as if you don't have a body. You keep it concealed, you keep it out of your view so that you can become what Paul says when he says, no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me, right? That we become a pure expression of God. And so that's what he's saying here. Chapter 68. What is nowhere to the bodily senses is everywhere spiritually, right? What would that be? That would be the I am, would it not? Your sense of I, that which is unchanging within you, is completely hidden to the bodily senses materially, but spiritually is everywhere, right? So we've already solved that riddle. We'll see what they have to say about it, but I think that's the riddle. Our outward nature reckons nothing of the work of this book. Okay. All right, so he jumps in. He says, similarly, where someone else would direct you to gather together all your powers and faculties within yourself and worship God there, I am not happy with such counsel, for fear of deceit, unless these words be taken in a bodily way, even though they are not, they are very well and truly said, and none more true if they are properly understood. Right? So he's wanting to make sure that you don't apply spiritual truth through the lens of egotism, right? Then don't do it through egotism. And, always make sure that you understand the spiritual. And this is why we use a word like realization, right? Because we talk about realizing God as if it's an attainment or an achievement. That's looking at realization through the lens of egoism, where it's an accomplishment that's performed by you that you get the reward for by being realized. And, he's very uncomfortable with that idea for obvious reasons, because we're misunderstanding the fact that we are divine by nature, right? And that it is not an attainment, it's a realization, which means it has always been true, right? We have always been of the nature of God. And so it's not changing in that way. He says, my counsel is to take care that you are in no sense within yourself. To put it briefly, I would have you be neither outside yourself, above yourself, nor behind, nor on the side or the other. Now, I struggled with understanding this until this week, where I caught myself or caught a moment where ego was being built. If you ever find yourself kind of leaving your bodily containment, which means kind of spinning off a third party to observe yourself, right, in your body mind, to think, you like well, like a good one for me that I could give a good example of is like when I give a lecture and it's over, right, and then I step outside myself and kind of look, how was that lecture? Did I do well? Did it sound good? You step outside yourself and look at yourself with some sort of analysis. Know for sure in that moment your ego is building itself. It's harvesting an idea of itself. It's gathering an attribute for itself, so it can view itself as a good speaker or not so good speaker. You know, or when you step outside yourself. Oh, did I say the right thing to my friend? Was I mean to my friend? You step outside yourself and you look at yourself. That's always creating ego. The ego is always harvesting you at that point. And so I think when he here talks about, my counsel uh, is to take care that you are in no sense within yourself. To put it briefly, I would have you be neither outside yourself, above yourself, nor behind, nor on one side, nor the other, right? That you would understand that by spirit you are everywhere. You are not of an egoistic perspective. You are not of a particular. You are universal. You're not in, you're not on, you're not beside, you're not under. You are that. Right. And he started off the chapter by telling us in mind, in our inner world, there is no direction. Right. So there's no place for us to consider ourselves to be. We are a universal self. He goes on, where then, you will say, am I to be? According to your reckoning, nowhere. Now indeed you speak well, for it is there that I would have you, because nowhere bodily is everywhere spiritually. Hmm. See, it says that without the body, we're not defined. We don't have a set of attributes. And so if we become bodily nothing, right, then we become spiritually everything. We return to our nature as general and no longer as particular. Take good care then that your spiritual exercise is nowhere bodily. Then, wherever the object is on which you set yourself to labor in the substance of your mind, truly you are there in spirit, right? Wherever the object is on which you set yourself to labor, whatever task you are doing in the substance of your mind, right? Which is really, that's because all of this is made of the substance of mind, right? We know this. Then, whatever the object is on which you set yourself to labor in the substance of your mind, truly you set yourself to labor in the substance of your mind, truly you are there in spirit, right? You're there in spirit, aware that you're dreaming, as it were, as truly as your body is in the place where you dwell bodily, right? So it's saying, it says you are everywhere in the same way that the body is here in one place. The truths are equal, but in spirit, we're everywhere. In body, we are particular. And though all your bodily faculties can find there nothing to feed on, because they think that what you are doing is nothing, carry on then with that nothing, as long as you are doing it for God's love. Right? So that nothing, this is what meditation really is all about. It's about deconstructing, removing ego, removing the veil that prevents us from the experience of universality, oneness with God, one without a second. Right? Because if spirit is of the nature of no boundary, you cannot have two. There's not room for two in infinity, right? Because of course, mathematically you can have two infinities, but as a practical demonstration of it, you cannot. Right? If something's got a boundary, you can't call it infinite. Which is funny. You can mathematically because you can say zero and then positive numbers go infinitely in that direction and negative numbers go infinitely in that direction. But you see, it only works because you start out with a specification. Negative numbers go infinitely that direction. Positive numbers go infinitely that direction. But positive numbers cannot be negative numbers, so they are not infinite. Right? And negative numbers cannot be positive numbers. For at least from the armchair mathematics perspective. So, though all your bodily faculties can find nothing to feed on, right? Because you're in the spiritual realm, right? You're in a dream. There it is. You have a dream it's made out of the subtle state, right? And so your body in bed, no matter how many grapes you eat in that dream, is not going to be satisfied at all by any grapes when it wakes up in the morning. So he's kind of saying that. He says, if you are in a spiritual state, the body's not getting any food, right? But that doesn't matter, he says. And though all your bodily faculties can find there nothing to feed on because they think that what you are doing is nothing, right? Anybody looking at you from a bodily perspective, you're sitting there meditating. Oh, wait, she's sitting there doing nothing all this time, right? Think that you're doing nothing, carry on then with that nothing, as long as you are doing it for God's love, right? So that's what gives your meditation value. You're doing it for God's love. You're doing it through the inspiration of unconditioned love, trying to stretch yourself wide enough and deep enough to accept this infinite notion of perfect love. As long as you are doing it for God's love, do not leave off, but press on. How? Earnestly, right? Because earnestness and sincerity are the two most important things in practice. Do not leave off, but press on earnestly in that nothing with an alert desire in your will to have God whom no man can know. Right? This is why we practice. This is why we do this exercise that he's been teaching. For I tell you truly that I would rather you be in this way nowhere bodily, wrestling with this blind nothing, than to have such power that I could be everywhere bodily whenever I would, happily engaged with all this something, like a lord with his possessions. Right? So he's saying it's better to forget your body than to interpret these things and try to become a superhero, right? Who can be anywhere that he wants to be. Because as long as you're in the body, you're ego driven. Only in spirit do you know yourself not to be body mind. Only then and so that's why the path to that place is to put the spirit in charge of the horses, in charge of the body and mind. That's why Ramakrishna tells us that, we can't, it's very hard for us to efface the ego completely. So we get it down as thin as we possible. And then what do? We put it in relationship to God. We put it under God, right? So that we're in relationship with God. And that is what brings us to our perfection. Leave aside this everywhere and this everything in exchange for this nowhere and this nothing, right? Beautifully stated, very interestingly stated. This nowhere is no place because spirit doesn't have place. It's not in time, space, causation, right? And this everywhere is the nature of spirit. God is everywhere present and always perfect, right? So we give up this idea of this notion of everywhere and everything, which is still a notion of boundaries uh, uh, and objects, even though they may be infinite, they may stretch everywhere. There's still a notion of body, a notion of boundary, a notion of separation. So he says, set aside this everywhere and everything. Don't think you're going to be so big that you, in body state, in ego state, are going to become God. That's not what we're saying. He says, rather exchange that for this idea of nowhere and nothing, right? And that will return you to that infinite peace that passes understanding. And that puts you into oneness with God, because now you truly have no boundary. And if God is everywhere present, and you also now are everywhere present, then thou art that. Never mind at all if your senses have no understanding of this nothing. Your senses cannot experience nothing. So they're not going to understand it. There's no way for you to uh, imagine non-existence as an ego. You just can't imagine not existing. It's Swami Prabhupada tell me that one time. Well, in a different way, though. I had tried to do what Ramana Maharshi did, right? To pretend I'm dying in order to come to realization. And I told Maharaj, I said, Maharaj, as much effort as I put into that, I can't imagine dying. And he said, that's because you would have to be able to imagine non-existence. And existence is your nature. You have never not existed. You have never died. You have never been born. So you will not be able to imagine any of those things. All you can do is become aware of your nature and negate it, right? But you can never imagine what it is to be nothing, because your nature is awareness, and in nothing, there is no awareness. Right? So you can't imagine it. Never mind at all if your senses have no understanding of this nothing. It is for this reason that I love it so much the better. Right? I love it because it's absolutely free of limit. I love it because it is of the nature of God. I love it because it is native to me. Right? It is so worthy a thing in itself that they can have no understanding of it. This nothing can be better felt than seen. It is most obscure and dark to those who have been looking at it only for a very short while. Right? So it's the nature of yourself is still obscured, even though you've been practicing for a while, right? Even if you've been looking for it, it's mostly obscure and dark, which means you don't really know. You have senses of love, senses of wisdom, senses of something outside of time, but it doesn't quite take form for you yet. because you've been looking at it for only a short time. Yet to speak more truly, a soul is more blinded in experiencing it because of the abundance of spiritual light than for any darkness or lack of bodily light. So let's see what he's saying. Yet to speak more truly, a soul is more blinded in experiencing it. This is that nothing and nowhere, right? So to speak more truly, a soul is more blinded in experiencing this nowhere, nothing, because of the abundance of spiritual light than for any darkness or lack of bodily light. Who is he that calls it nothing? It is surely our outward man, not our inward, right? It's surely that outward man, that ego-produced self, as opposed to the spiritual self. Our inward man calls it all, right? He gets this from 2 Corinthians 6:16. Our inward man calls it all, for because of it, he is well taught to have understanding of all bodily or spiritual, all things bodily or spiritual, without any specific knowledge of any one thing in itself. Right? So he's saying that we are well taught to have understanding of all things bodily or spiritual without any specific knowledge, right? Any knowledge of individuality, any knowledge of separation, any knowledge that contains attributes or boundaries, which in a word, me and mine, right? That if we can, without the idea of me and mine, taught to have understanding of all things bodily or spiritual without any specific knowledge of any one thing. And then he says, and why didn't he just say one thing? Why did he say one thing in itself? It's because no object has an independent, inherent existence in itself. All things seen, tasted, touched, heard, or smelled require the presence of the divine for their existence, right? Requires your awareness of it for it to exist. And it cannot, if God is removed, it cannot remain of its own accord. It cannot be a thing in itself, right? It can only be a thing in relationship to God. All right. I think, yes, we'll stop there.